Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about profiles that confront a misconception. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the essay, The Myth of the Kindly General Lee by Adam Serwer. A couple of things that you should be getting out of this video. One is more information about how to actually confront a misconception when writing a profile, because this is a very common thing that profiles do, and it's a very effective way of engaging an audience's interest, particularly if they believe the thing that you're saying is untrue. The second is you should get a model of close reading, of how we actually look at the bits and pieces, the minutiae of a text in order to really understand it. And that's a really, really important skill as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this is my version of this article. I saved it as the reader option from The Atlantic. So basically, this is just the text. I don't have any of the images or anything like that. It was originally included here. No worries for this, for our purposes. So we start out here with a very direct statement. The strangest part about the continued personality cult of Robert E. Lee is how few of the qualities his admirers profess to see in him he actually possessed. So, of course, we've got the title, The Myth of the Kindly General Lee here, which initially tells us right off the bat that this is going to be confronting that particular idea of Robert E. Lee as a kindly, benevolent dude. But then this first sentence here leaves no possible question about what exactly is going to be discussed here. This is very clearly right from the beginning confronting a misconception. And this opening sentence actually does so in such a way that it's more likely to hook the reader's interest. When he says, how few of the qualities his admirers profess to see in him, when Serwer says this, that's pointing us toward the first bit of the context, the first bit of information that he really needs to establish in order to confront this as a misconception. He hasn't yet told us what these things are, but he's told us that this is one of the things that we're going to be learning. And that's really, really important for any scenario in which you're confronting a misconception. You need to actually establish not only what that misconception is, but that there are people who believe it. Otherwise, it's not necessarily all that convincing. I mean, you can try and make any argument cooler, sexier, spicier, whatever it is, by just saying other people think something differently. But if I, as a reader, say, I've never heard somebody express that belief, I'm not really convinced that anybody does believe that, then it sounds like you've got an artificial construct here. It sounds like you're not responding to a real world position. Instead, you've just made something up as a sort of rhetorical plot point to support your argument. So that's one of the things. And I'm actually going to come back to this second paragraph here. But just a little bit later, we get a really nice brief summation of the myth itself. This is the third paragraph. And Serwer says, the myth of Lee goes something like this. He was a brilliant strategist and devoted Christian man who abhorred slavery and labored tirelessly after the war to bring the country back together. These are the specific points that this article is going to address. And so that's another really good strategy as a writer to give us, here is a set of things I'm going to talk about. Sometimes this takes the form of what we call the roadmap, that strategy that you sometimes get in an introduction where you say, first, this article is going to talk about X, then it's going to talk about Y, then it's going to conclude Z. Here, we don't have quite that. We don't have quite a roadmap because these points are not necessarily going to be addressed specifically in this order, although they're roughly addressed in this order. but we have the specific characteristics of the myth being laid out. And that's really, really important, again, for defining exactly what it is that this argument is responding to. What is that misconception? We need to know, and we need to be convinced that people believe it. As we go through, we get some concessions. Lee was a Christian. He was, at least debatably, a great strategist. Some would say more a great tactician than strategist. Not really that important for our purposes. Serwer is willing to concede these points because there is historical evidence to support them. And they're not really that important for the larger argument he wants to make in the larger context that he wants to make this argument. And I actually want to bring us back to that second paragraph when we talk about context, because this paragraph establishes some context. So this essay was published around Memorial Day 2017, and it was published shortly after a statue of Robert E. Lee was removed from New Orleans. This was a big thing in the late 2010s. COVID kind of slowed this down, I think, because everything shut down. But in a few years, from about 2014 up through 2020, when the COVID pandemic really hit, there was a big spate of Confederate statues being removed, mostly from public non-battlefield land. And so there was a statue of Lee that was taken down from New Orleans. And a lot of this had to do with the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of this had to do with rising resistance to lost cause mythology that glorifies and romanticizes the Confederacy and downplays the very real defense of slavery that was key to the Confederate cause. And Serwer's article talks about this as well and provides some historical evidence for the centrality of slavery in the cause of the Confederacy. So we get that context. And again, that's one of the things you always want to be doing in an essay, is establishing, why is this important? What are the stakes? Why does this matter? And so the context in 2017 was these major cultural battles over removing monuments honoring Confederate leaders. So that's our context. And essentially what Serwer argues is that in this context, reevaluating Lee and trying to confront the lost cause mythology, which is historians have studied the lost cause myth. There's a lot of documented evidence about how this was created in order to uphold racial segregation and racial inequality in the South after the Civil War, as well as to justify the war, retroactively justify the war in a post-slavery context. There's a lot of historical information about this. There's a lot of analysis of this. But there's also a lot of people who still buy into lost cause mythology. And so one of the things that Serwer has to do, one of the things you always have to do when you're confronting a misconception is, again, show that people actually believe that. And so we get that in this paragraph that I've currently got highlighted. In the Richmond Times-Dispatch, R. David Cox wrote that for white supremacist protesters to invoke his name violates Lee's most fundamental convictions. In the conservative publication Town Hall, Jack Kerwick concluded that Lee was among the finest human beings that has ever walked the earth. John Daniel Davidson, in an essay for The Federalist, opposed the removal of the Lee statue in part on the grounds that Lee arguably did more than anyone to unite the country after the war and bind up its wounds. Praise for Lee of this sort has flowed forth from past historians and presidents alike. So this paragraph does a really, really good job clearly and specifically establishing not just the content of the myth that Serwer has identified, but that people actually believe it. And people have published articles praising Lee for the specific things that Serwer has said are mythical, that are not true. And then this is Serwer's conclusion about this, about the lost cause myth. This is too divorced from Lee's actual life to even be classed as fan fiction. It is simply historical illiteracy. So that's his central argument here. That's his main claim. This is nonsense as far as history goes. And then the rest of the article is basically spent providing evidence for that, providing evidence that Lee was quite a brutal slave owner. And actually, even the things that Lost Cause supporters point to try and show how benevolent he was, actually, if you look at them in their entire context, they paint a worse picture of him. So we've got, for instance, this section, which is a really good way of providing evidence, because this is actually Lee's own words. This is a quotation taken from a letter that Lee wrote that's often pointed to by people who want to say Lee was generally cool with African Americans. And the evidence from the letter that often gets left out in the mythology tells us otherwise, tells us that this is not in fact the case. And so and then we get interpretation of this. Again, this is the basic structure of an academic argument. You make a claim, you provide evidence, you interpret it. Serwer does this consistently, and he goes through these different claims that people have made about Lee, and he provides counter evidence. He draws from the work of historians, secondary texts in addition to the primary texts. So we got Reading the Man by Elizabeth Brown Pryor. We've got other ones. We've got quotations directly from people who knew Lee, in this case, one of Lee's slaves. We have actual recorded testimony from people that Robert E. Lee enslaved that tells us something about this guy. So this is a very compelling piece of evidence, because if Lee was such a beloved slave master, if he was such a gentle, kind dude, chances are his slaves would not have hated him as much as they seemed to have. So we've got these kinds of things, and I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. We've got a number of pieces of evidence supporting the argument that Lee was very racist. How racist he was compared to other people fighting for the Confederacy at the time is a bit hard to say, because we don't have a good comparative analysis here. But the idea that Lee was not racist, or that he was somehow benevolent or something like this, is really, really, really undermined by the tacit support of Confederate soldiers kidnapping free Black people when they entered Northern Territory, the slaughter of African American troops without accepting surrender, all these kinds of things. The idea that Lee promoted reconciliation after the war, this is taken apart by evidence comparing Lee to other former Confederates who did a much better job of actually promoting reunification. It quotes Grant saying that Lee did at best a grudging job, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got all of this stuff. We go through, and again, the structure for confronting that misconception is continually evident throughout this article. People believe X thing. Here is the counter evidence. Here's the reason that is not true. We can see that over and over and over again And then toward the end, we get a nice summation. We get a good overall representation of the central argument from the beginning. This section, for instance, Lee is a pivotal figure in American history worthy of study. Neither the man who really existed nor the fictionalized tragic hero of the lost cause are heroes worthy of a statue in a place of honor. So again, what we have here is the confrontation with that myth, saying what people believe is basically not true, but then tying it to the larger context. Because again, at the beginning of the article, we have this discussion of the context of removing Confederate statues in order to try and promote a greater degree of racial equality in the US. So structurally, that's a really good technique because we've connected from the end of the article back to the beginning, which not only reminds us of the stakes of this article and the context of this article, it also creates that sort of loop so that the article feels like it has closure because we have the introduction and the conclusion linked, connected back together. So that's another really good rhetorical technique. So basically, those are the kinds of key things. Those are the kinds of key things that you want to do when you are writing a profile or any sort of essay that confronts a misconception. You want to be thinking about, how do I prove that people actually believe the thing I'm saying that they believe? And what sorts of evidence do I need in order to disprove it? Why does it matter? These are some of the big things to be thinking about. And I think Adam Serwer's The Myth of the Kindly General Lee is an extremely good example of what that structure may look like in practice.